I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS. Once a year, for the not very many years yet of this podcast, I have put out a bonus birthday episode as a present to myself, sort of. Thank you, by the way, to the people who've written me some lovely notes today. And some yesterday. Early's also good. Late's good as well. I think this, because I have been trying to catch back up on a regular schedule and because I put out a bunch of sort of multi-part old Secret Show episodes recently, I think I'm just going to stick with the one regular feed episode this week. And I'm going to try to get it out today. So I'm recording this on my birthday. I'm going to try to get it out the same day. I was in the middle of editing a really lovely interview Alice and I did with Victoria Moole, which will be forthcoming. But then I had to take my dog to the groomer, and in the car, I've mentioned this before, until recently, Versecraft, Elijah's podcast, was literally the only podcast I listened to that is not filled with profanity. So I also recently subscribed to Jason Gray's new poetry podcast, Drunk as a Poet on Payday, which I think is a Simpsons reference. He interviews poets about their first, not their first books. I hope not. About new books they have out. He's going to be speaking to me in a couple weeks. So I believe is also clean. I hope. Well, we'll see. It'll be a challenge, as it was with Mark McGinnis's Mouthful of Air. But I will do my best. But as I said, typically when my girls are in the car, I listen to, if not Taylor Swift or Billie Eilish, I listen to Versecraft because it doesn't have lots of horrible language that would leave terrible impressions on them. And they think it's me talking. So they then leave with an impression that their father is smarter than he actually is. Anyway, I listened very belatedly today to an episode of Versecraft called Giving the Anti-Hero His Due, Giving the Devil His Due, and then it's about the idea of the romantic anti-hero in poetry and in literature more broadly. It's a very smart and very thoroughly thought through study. Probably my favorite Versecraft episodes are those in which Elijah takes on kind of a bigger idea or a bigger theme that cuts across a number of different works, in addition to doing his nice close studies of poems. And so I very much recommend this episode. It was, I think I want to make a distinction between what is like total, honest, clear-eyed disagreement between the two of us, and then I think like maybe my only slight criticism to offer, and I'll only offer it publicly rather than privately because I think it's so slight, is that I think you should probably have titled it "Giving the Devil Almost His Due." And then one moment where I think you do, Elijah does a very good study of Ulysses in Dante's Inferno as he says something like the exemplar, the ideal of the romantic anti-hero. And it's a very good discussion of Ulysses in that poem. But he describes the ideal of the romantic anti-hero as being damned but still looking sexy while doing it. And I think like this, that like again, like just the slightest adjustment there is that by saying like and looking sexy while doing it, like we lose the perspective of the romantic anti-hero there. Like I think if you're going to really give the devil his due, you have to go ahead and give that definition in as it would be understood by the romantic anti-hero. And so it would probably be something closer to damned but unbroken. And then like the cynical and probably fair assessment of it from outside that perspective would say, well, so you endure eternal torment, but you look sexy while doing it, so you're a fool. But I think the romantic anti-hero himself, or at least the romantic anti-hero in his self-conception, would say he's damned but unbroken, or something along those lines. Anyway, very good treatment of the subject. But so here's where I think there is a real substantial disagreement, and I wanted to talk about it a little bit more broadly than just in this episode, because one of the examples Elijah brings up of a work of he talks about maybe a distinction between some different ways to treat the romantic anti-hero. And one way to treat the romantic anti-hero, the purely romantic way to do it, is to say, is in celebration of his defiance, right? That basically, oh, by the way, like very smart connection he makes. I just bopped the mic. I hope that didn't spike it. Very smart connection he makes, or I think implicitly makes, is between the idea of the romantic and the idea of of Nietzsche's slave morality, or Nietzsche's ressentiment. That basically, like the romantics looking sexy is a version of, what Nietzsche would call the slave morality's sour grapes, right? That like, well, we can't be the Ubermensch. We can't be that wasn't how he used Ubermensch. We can't be the blonde beast. We can't be the Vikings. We can't be the gentles. We can't be the overlords. And so instead we will have nasty things to say about them, and we will savor our nastiness, and that will be our reward. And so it was, I think, like a very, very smart kind of implicit link that Elijah drew between romanticism and or the romantic worldview rather, and the worldview of slave morality. By the way, for those of you listening, for those of you listening for the first time, probably not a great episode to start on. I am indulging myself on my birthday by just leaping straight in the way. Like this is the sort of voice message or series of text messages that like Alice or Cameron or Elijah are used to getting from me, usually in the middle of the night. But I do like there are a few, I think, really interesting ideas here, and so I wanted to talk about them. But one of the examples Elijah brings up is that of Madame Bovary. So Gustave Flaubert's very famous book about an unhappy provincial housewife living in the French countryside in the late 19th century, mid 19th century, maybe, I forget. So Elijah brought this up. He quoted Flaubert, who famously said, "Madame Bovary, c'est moi," or is supposed to have said that. I'm not sure what the precise source is on that. Madame Bovary is me. I am she. And Elijah's account of that declaration was that in Bovary, Flaubert recognized his own faults. And by writing the book, he was skewering. I think he called it a vicious satire of the faults of the person who would do as and think as Emma Bovary does. And so Flaubert was purging himself of these excesses, of this wrong way of thinking. And Elijah praises the book for being very rich in its depiction of this faulty, wrong worldview, but ultimately at the same time, making very clear why this worldview is so wrong, and allowing us to kind of come out securely on the other side, saying, well, we will not be like Emma Bovary, having felt deep empathy for her and having come to understand her, but ultimately also to have passed a very confident judgment on her and feeling safe, putting her at an arm's length distance from us, as Flaubert sort of wished to, recognizing in himself those things that he was sort of getting rid of by writing them out into Emma Bovary. He cites The Sorrows of Young Werther as another example of this exercise, this artistic exercise. I have not read The Sorrows of Young Werther. I think like it just sounds so fucking boring to me. Maybe I should have read it when I was a teenager. I don't know. But I just can't bring myself to. Curiously, not curiously, because it's a very famous book, but I got a note from a very thoughtful reader and listener not long ago about the epigraph to my book. So the book of poetry, Midlife, out now from Measure Press. Go buy a copy, link in the show notes. The epigraph to that book is from Madame Bovary. The epigraph is, "She wanted to die and also to live in Paris." And then there is, in addition to that, there is in the book, there's one poem called Chez Bovary, or at the house of Bovary. The existence of Chez as a word it's just delightful. But it is a kind of a brief dramatic monologue in the voice of Charles Bovary, Emma's husband, speaking to his wife. And he believes he has things to teach her, and he probably does have some things to teach her. Though the Charles in the book is, I think, a really wonderfully modeled character. That like he is wiser than her in some respects, but he is also foolish. And then in the end, I think like rather heartbreakingly, he kind of becomes a goth, idolizing her after she's dead. That he does not at all learn the lesson that Elijah suggests that we ought to learn from Madame Bovary. He seems rather to go into a kind of a perpetual mourning after the image of Bovary as he kind of comes to understand her, not maybe totally accurately at the end of the book. For those who are not already familiar, like the overall plot of the book is that Emma Bovary marries Charles Bovary, this doctor. They move to a little town in the provinces. She gets very bored and she has a couple of adulterous affairs, and then ultimately she gets I forget if it's like she takes something in order to maybe get it. I forget exactly what it is, but basically as a result of having one of these affairs, she ends up getting very sick and having like a really physically horrible death. So a reader wrote to me recently to say like she thought I was too hard on Emma Bovary, and that I needed to understand where she was coming from when she wanted to die, but also to live in Paris. So there is that line comes from a passage in the book, because I think like really the meat of the book is not about the affairs. Like the affairs are honestly like sort of like failed exercises in the larger struggle that she undergoes, which is to recognize that her own life is inconsequential, is tertiary, is way far out away from the center of things, and sort of quotidian, not very important. And the affairs are very much an attempt to kind of to chase after something beautiful and meaningful and filled with the quality of story. I mean, this is the thing I've said about Romanticism, that basically the Romantic worldview is the worldview that we either live in a story, or we live in a novel, or we wish we lived in a novel, right? That the romantic values are not classical values. They're not good, obviously and objectively. They're good because they're good for the story, right? And she chases after something like that. Like she makes classically bad choices in order to pursue romantically good ends. And so I think like I get why apparently the overwhelming verdict on Madame Bovary is that this is a book in which, like, best case scenario, Flaubert is exorcising his own moral failings in the figure of Madame Bovary, and perhaps more likely, he is merely venting his spleen at womankind by depicting this sort of pathetic, self-indulgent moppet of a woman with no gratitude for what her husband's done for her, no gratitude, no appreciation for her good fortune, and a willingness to destroy her own life and the lives of others in pursuit of a sort of a deluded whimsy. So I think, like, what I said to the reader who wrote to me saying, like, it's a good line that you quote in the epigraph, but it's sort of cruel to Emma. It's cruel to Emma to say, oh, she wanted to die, but also to live in Paris. Like, ho, ho, ho. What a dummy. What a naive fool. What a pitiful, typical woman. And I agree. If that is what that line is saying, and if that is what I am saying by quoting it, then that is cruel, and that is unfair, and that is shitty. And honestly, if the book is not just if it is a misogynistic exercise, depicting the excesses of the French provincial, middle class woman, but even if it is merely a way for Flaubert to purge his own sinfulness, like if it is just a way for him to get out of himself those things he does not like about himself and expose them, however richly and complexly. And again, like I want to give the I don't know, giving the angel his due sounds so fucking corny. I want to give Elijah his due and say, like, Elijah would never and does never advocate, writing simplistic moralizing narratives. He definitely does not want paint by numbers morality plays. He wants rich, complex depictions of humanity. He does, and I think like the slight distinction is that he does ultimately want there to be, a clear, if not easy, right side to the debate. Like ultimately, even if it is very rich and very complex and very long and very humane and compassionate, it should ultimately be clear that one side is right and the other, however understandable, is wrong. And if that's not what he means, if that's not what you mean, Elijah, then I apologize. But that is my understanding, and I want to give like full credit to your intolerance for knee jerky, cheap, simplistic moralizing. I know like nobody, as Brian has pointed out, like nobody listening to the show wants that. So you don't need to keep saying it's bad. Nobody's interested in that. But even if Flaubert is only working out his own faults on the page and doing so in a very sophisticated way, not at all in a, and I know Elijah as a philosophy major is gonna, his ears will perk up at sophisticated. I don't mean that in a snotty way. I'm trying to come up with another way to say rich and complex and not simplistic. Even if that is what Flaubert is doing, I still think that the book sucks as a result. Like, I think that's a shitty reason to write a book, honestly. I think finding problems in yourself, finding faults in yourself, and working them out on the page is essential to writing. And I think like Alice and I are planning an episode, have been for quite a while, about something kind of along those lines, following maybe a slightly Freudian thread. But if involved in that exorcism is a conclusion that, well, this is bad and this other thing would be good, and there is a right side in contrast, then I think that is really disappointing. And it is, I'll make a terrible confession here, which is that I love epic poems. And I've read a lot of epic poems. I certainly have not read all of the epic poems that have been translated into English. I've got one, Aaron Pachigian translated from Apollonius, the Argonautica. I'm eager to read that. I've got a couple Derek Walcott epic poems I'm eager to read. So there's lots on the bookshelf. But an epic poem, the epic poem in English that I have not read, have never read, was not an English major, never was assigned to read, and have not read since then, is Paradise Lost. I've never read Paradise Lost. I know Cameron loves it. I know Cameron, the deeply amoral and perhaps even in a Wildian sense immoral reader, loves Paradise Lost. I know Elijah certainly loves it as well. I bought a copy recently. I will read it. I will. Here's why I have been so hesitant to read it. Because I know there's a right answer. Because I know there's a right side to it. It's one of the things that makes the Divine Comedy so boring. The Divine Comedy is amazing, astonishing as a work of architecture and as a work of versecraft. As an epic poem, I think it's a stinker. I think it has some wonderful chapters in it, but they are mere episodes. The Divine Comedy is a panorama. So structurally speaking, that's why it's boring as an epic. I think morally, the reason it's boring is that there's a right answer. Like the presence of Virgil allows the moral perspective of the Divine Comedy to be complicated enough for long enough that we at least do give the devil, again, almost his due. But to read a whole plot-driven epic in which there is simply a right and a wrong side just sounds unbelievably dreary to me. Like, imagine the Iliad if Homer had just done what was expected, which is to say, well, the Achaeans are the good guys. and the Trojans are the decadent, spoiled, rapacious Easterners, and we trounced them good. Right? What a shitty, boring story that would be. And maybe it would have some wonderful passages, and maybe it would have some masterly handling of the hexameter. But like, what a boring story. And it is what makes, like, growing up reading a lot of, I don't know if the I don't know if the Bible counts as an epic or a series of epics rather, but like reading those stories, like part of the reason that the Old Testament is so much more interesting than the New Testament. The New Testament has some great dialogue, I would say for the most part, much, much better dialogue because it has so much dialogue. And because Jesus is such a good talker. Like Jesus is so witty and so funny and so wise. Like he's such a wonderful talker. And so his dialogue, the words of Christ in red are fantastic. The story of the New Testament, I mean, okay, fine. But compared to the Old Testament, it's like there's no contest because the Old Testament, like the God of the Hebrews is right basically because it's basically might makes right. Like the argument of the Old Testament is might makes right. Right? Like other gods have their sorcerers. His sorcerers are better. His sorcerers are more powerful. He's the right God because he can crush the Egyptians under his thumb. Right? Like, he's the right God because the brothers of Dinah massacre an entire city because the prince raped their sister. They actually circumcise all the men first, and then while the men are writhing in pain from their circumcisions, they go back on their treaty and then they murder them all. And their father says, "What have you done?" And then the chapter ends and they move on to a different story. Like, that's a fucking epic. That's what I love in Beowulf. It's what I love in the Iliad. It's what I love in the Odyssey. It's what I love in Gilgamesh. It's what I love in much of the Aeneid, but it's what starts to get a little bit stiff in the Aeneid because, again, there is ultimately kind of a right side. It is so unconvincingly right to my modern eyes and ears that like I can sort of enjoy it in that way. But I think having been raised Christian, the idea of a Christian epic just sounds like a fucking snooze fest. Like, honestly, it sounds like a 600-page A Christmas Carol. And like A Christmas Carol's fine, but I don't know if you grew up in like a city-dwelling Christian family that with regular theater tickets, like you've seen like 8,000 productions of A Christmas Carol, and the best part of A Christmas Carol is the ghost of Christmas past, who just wants people to enjoy themselves and is a little bit of a pagan god snuck into the midst of a Christian play. All right. Christian play also may be arguably like neoliberal capitalist play. that's a question for another time. Like, Scrooge. My defense of Scrooge is that Scrooge believes that the poor should be taken care of by government services, and Dickens thinks that that the poor should be taken care of by the beneficence of the wealthy. When they deign to do so, in order to feel explicitly, in order to absolve themselves and make themselves feel good. Like the care of the poor should be entrusted to the self-absolution of the Carnegies and the Johns Hopkinses of the universe. So there's that. But the reason I use the epigraph from Bovary, the reason I love Madame Bovary, and I think at this point I'm fucking the only person who thinks this way, is that, yes, of course there are colossal limitations to Emma Bovary's perspective. Of course she is provincial. She is limited in her outlook. She is self-indulgent. But, like, Emma Bovary, c'est moi. Like, I mean, honestly, literally, c'est moi. Like, I married a doctor. We moved to a small town in the provinces. I was, laid up with a brain tumor and underemployed and then dealing with small children and have sort of not really been able to build a life here. And I have great comfort and privilege and good fortune. And I'm very grateful for that. I love my wife and my daughters. And I'm not especially interested in starting affairs with local gentle ladies. But like, did I early on, and do I still, to some extent, dream about life in like an honest to God city, like somewhere where I could say go to theater regularly and have it be good? We are going to my daughter's summer camp production of Willy Wonka, in which she will be wonderful, and I will be delighted, and that will be nothing but good and joyful and wholesome. But yeah, I wouldn't mind. I wouldn't mind going to see some real theater every once in a while. And I wouldn't mind, honestly, like in a culture in which 90% of our publications come out of New York or LA, and everybody who lives in those fucking cities is convinced that they are actually the center of the world. Like, yeah, it is, I think, forgivable to begin to get that impression as one living in the provinces. And sometimes to resent it, but also sometimes to distract oneself with delusions and fantasies. Like I had a funny experience. I got hired to do this job a few years ago, and the guy, I did a Zoom interview with him. It was all remote, and he expressed surprise during the interview that I was not in New York, because he had read up on me. He'd read stuff on my website, and he'd learned about me, and he assumed I was in New York. And the immediate feeling I had in response to that was pleasure. I felt flattered. I felt flattered that he thought I was in New York, because that would mean I was somebody, or I was at least somewhere. For the same reason, I had to fill out some bios recently for some things, and it's always a question. I try to keep the bio as short as possible, because they're so terrible to read. Like, if you ever read anything in a bio, it's maybe like one sentence worth, and so I try to keep mine to as close to one sentence as possible. Though if you send in a one sentence bio, people get a little antsy. So I try to send in a 2-sentence bio. But it's a live question for me every single time. Do I include where I live? Because I have two impulses. One is my fuck you reflex, which is fuck you, I live in North Carolina. And the other is my I don't know, like educated coastal liberal would-be elite impulse, which is like, hey, if I don't say I live in North Carolina, then somebody who bothers to read my bio might make the mistake of thinking I live somewhere and therefore am somebody, or at least might be. Right? Because if you do a poetry podcast out of Brooklyn, then that sounds like you're a real alternative media figure. If you do a poetry podcast out of Carrboro, North Carolina, what the fuck am I doing reading about your poetry podcast out of Carrboro, North Carolina? Right? So when I read Madame Bovary, I don't read it as a book chastising Emma Bovary and ultimately concluding that, well, she had it wrong and there is this other right way to do it. I think she does get things wrong. But I also don't think there's a right way to do it. When she says, when Flaubert says of her, she wanted to die and also to live in Paris, I think he is recognizing something that is fundamentally true about human beings. Like, I think this is an experience I so deeply relate to, and that I don't get to purge from myself, either when I read this book or even if I were to write a book. I mean, I have written books about characters who have profound flaws that I recognize, and that I recognize as flaws. And I don't feel purged of them afterward, because I don't think there is a right answer. I think there's some better and some worse. But I don't think that, I think that the people who sneer at Emma Bovary, the people who condemn her in the book and outside the book, I think that they are correct to identify her faults. I think they are incorrect in failing to acknowledge that they're no more right. There is no right side. There is no ultimate perspective of wisdom and correctness. I think there's some better and some worse. And when I read Madame Bovary, I feel deep, deep empathy for Emma. I don't come out of it concluding, well, let's shape up or ship out. It's really time to get over this feeling like you're from the provinces. But you should accept yourself. I'm going to read this is like a slightly long passage, but I wanted to find a passage that I think exemplifies what one might call the satirical tendency in this book, right? This is from early on in the book, the first part, where she's out in the provinces. She's dreaming of Paris. It is very similar, by the way, to the way that in The Three Sisters, the great Chekhov play, not my favorite of his plays, but a great play, the three sisters and their brother who live out in, ass-fuck Russia somewhere. I don't know if, can you say ass-fuck Russia homophobic? I don't know. Again, which is not to say there's anything wrong with ass-fucking. It's just to say they might do it in this small town in Russia, and that sounds fine. Only it's not Moscow. Moscow is where the sisters and the brother want to be. And Moscow is where the world is. Moscow is where, if they were living in Moscow, they would be living a real life that really mattered. And you know who else thinks that? People who live in Moscow. Including the people who live in Moscow who might sneer at these ladies. It actually, rereading some passages from Three Sisters, I know I'm completely going off on a tangent. It's my fucking birthday episode. Go fuck yourself. Don't go fuck yourself. I'm sorry. But like rereading some passages from the Three Sisters today after listening to Elijah's episode, I thought, I might have a better understanding of the famous controversy concerning the treatment of the production of Chekhov's plays, right? Because Chekhov was a failed playwright. He was a short story writer. He was a failed playwright until Konstantin Stanislavski got a hold of his scripts and started producing them in the Moscow Art Theater. And then they were wildly successful. Stanislavski presented them, and what he became very famous for, and he was, another great example of somebody great being successful for shitty reasons. Konstantin Stanislavski, like one of the great, theatrical geniuses of all time, was successful. Yeah, sure, probably partly because he was good at what he did, but largely because under Soviet rule, strict realism was a safer bet than sort of wild symbolism or experimental theater that could might be sneaking in messages about God knows what, and might even be, God forbid, counter-revolutionary. Whereas strict realism, especially if it was strict realism satirizing the bourgeoisie, was a very, very safe form of art for the regime to endorse. Stanislavski, though, he took Chekhov's plays and he produced them with heartbreaking faithfulness to lived experience. He wanted his audiences to feel as if these characters were really alive. I had a friend, I may have mentioned this on the podcast before, but I had a friend growing up who we did plays together in this theater in Atlanta, and his father was an actor trained at the Moscow Art Theater. This is the theater, legendary theater in the world over. I mean, if you studied theater, like the Moscow Art Theater is, I hesitate to say Mecca, but something like that. It is where Stanislavski made his mark, and he trained and directed there. He trained students and actors and directed plays there for many, many years. It is the source of the much mistaken so-called method in American acting, which was a really a kind of a bastardization of Stanislavski's techniques. That's Lee Strasberg and what's her name? I don't remember. It's been a long time since I graduated from drama school, which is to say fake school. Okay, so I got a little off track there. The controversy, which many people think of as being very funny in itself, is that when Stanislavski produced Chekhov's plays and they were a big hit, Chekhov was very unhappy. He was very unhappy with this production, the production of these plays. And for you historians, yes, Stanislavski had success before the revolution, but boy did the revolution help him out, and boy did it not help out his competitors. And also, do I think that he should have renounced his success because the regime that supported him also did some arguably horrifying things. I will just say I don't feel comfortable passing judgment on him for not refusing their blessing. But the controversy was that Chekhov was very unhappy with Stanislavski's production. And the reason he was unhappy is that he said, no, my plays are comedies. You are producing them like they're tragedies. And if you have watched a Chekhov play, then you may understand why people often laugh when they learn that Chekhov thought his plays were comedies. I think they are... I know I've mentioned Vanya on 42nd Street, the great Andrei Gregory Wallace Shawn collaboration, and Louis Malle actually filmed it, but it was a theatrical collaboration between Andrei Gregory and Wallace Shawn, who also produced with Louis Malle, also produced My Dinner at Andre's with Andre. My Dinner at Andre's. Well, that would be like a much dumber knockoff version of My Dinner with Andre. If you watch Vanya on 42nd Street, then I think you will see the way in which, particularly in the hands of like a great actor like Wallace Shawn, the plays are tragic and they are comic. They are tragedies and they are comedies. It's possible that Stanislavski simply missed the self-deprecating funny beats in the plays. I suspect, however, that what might actually have happened is that Chekhov was writing with a little more contempt for his characters than was good for the story. It's one of the reasons I think writers should almost never direct their own work. It's not that there aren't exceptions. It's not that there aren't some great movies and productions that have been directed by the people who wrote them. Sure, of course that happens. But as a rule of thumb, I think it is a very bad idea for a writer to direct his own work. And I think the Chekhov-Stanislavski collaboration might be a good demonstration of this principle, which is to say, I think if Chekhov truly thought his plays were merely comedies, if he thought they were comedies but not also tragedies, then I think he was probably writing them as self-purging satires, as vicious satires, I think was Elijah's phrase, mocking the bourgeoisie, as well as the uppity serf, former serfs, whom he's also pretty, who also come off as foolish in a lot of his plays. If he was merely mocking them for their excesses and wanted the audience to laugh at them, and that would make for a much, much lesser play. I can imagine that if he really thought that what people should come away with is a sense that, oh, look how well and richly and thoughtfully rendered the errors, the faults of these other people are. And even if we can understand them and empathize with them to an extent, we still come out confidently knowing that there is a right side and they are not on it. If that was what Chekhov wanted from his productions, then I understand why he would have been disappointed by Stanislavski. Because Stanislavski was really just concerned with telling the truth of the moment by moment. I suspect Stanislavski would not have been a good playwright, because it probably does take a little bit of a sense of overstory, a little bit of a sense of through line, a little bit of a sense of even, destiny or fate or the workings of the gods in order to shape a story longer than a single scene. And I don't know if Stanislavski could have done that. Chekhov could do it, but Chekhov seemed to need Stanislavski's help in restraining his worst impulses, which were to mock his characters and to create a safe distance for mockery. I think in a really good production of a play like Vanya, you laugh and you cry because it is hilarious and it is absolutely shattering. And that is my experience of Madame Bovary. I do recognize her excesses. The reason I included the line "she wanted to die and also to live in Paris" is because it is a funny line, and it is a funny line that points out an error, but it is an error very, very familiar to me. I mean, I've compared it elsewhere to some of some of the little slippages that Freud points out in psychopathology, and it's not Sorry. Psychopathology and Its Discontents is the title of a great non-existent Freud book that somebody should write someday. The Psychopathology of Everyday Life. This is where he talks about the verbal errors that have come to be called Freudian slips. And the thing he points out in them is not that, like, when somebody says she wanted, when somebody has a thought like she wanted to die or also to live in Paris, or the line that I know I've compared it with is, he refers to a husband saying, of his wife, his marriage. He says, if one of us should die, I would move to Paris. Because one of us is always my wife dying. When Freud points out these slips, these little sloppinesses, these little revealing moments of our often self-serving, often slightly childish, motivations, he is not doing so because there's a right side. And we want to be on that side away from these people. He's doing it because it is how we are. I do want to read this passage from Bovary, in which she's fantasizing about Paris. She's fantasizing about living in Paris. Paris, more vague than the ocean, glimmered before Emma's eyes with a silvery glow. The many lives that stirred amid this tumult were, however, divided into parts, classed as distinct pictures. Emma perceived only 2 or 3 that hid from her all the rest, and in themselves represented all humanity. The world of ambassadors moved over polished floors in drawing rooms lined with mirrors, round oval tables covered with velvet and gold-fringed cloths. There were dresses with trains, deep mysteries, anguish hidden beneath smiles. Then came the society of the duchesses. All were pale, all got up at 4 o'clock. The women, poor angels, wore English point on their petticoats, and the men, their talents hidden under a frivolous appearance, rode horses to death at pleasure parties, spent the summer season at Baden, and ended up on reaching their 40s by marrying heiresses. In the private rooms of restaurants where one dines after midnight by the light of wax candles, the colorful crowd of writers and actresses held sway. They were prodigal as kings, full of ambitious ideals and fantastic frenzies. They lived far above all others, among the storms that raged between heaven and earth, partaking of the sublime. As for the rest of the world, it was lost, with no particular place, and as if non-existent. Anyway, the nearer things were, the more her thoughts turned away from them. All her immediate surroundings, the wearisome countryside, the petty bourgeois stupidity, the mediocrity of existence, seemed to her the exception. An exception in which she had been caught by a stroke of fate, while beyond stretched as far as eye could see an immense land of joys and passions. She's fantasizing about living in Paris while being forced to live in the provinces. Is that a wildly unrealistic vision of Paris? Yes. Is there folly in that habit of daydreaming and of neglecting your immediate surroundings? Yes, of course. Do I now, or will I ever, feel confident distancing myself from that tendency? No. I don't think I'll ever be purged of it either. And I think if you were to stop and say, all right, let's get rid of this fantasy of Paris, and you look at your life here, do I think there is finally a correct way to live? No, I don't. I think that we're all caught in folly. I think that we are all romantics. And I think if you believe that there is a right answer, however difficult, however obscure, however cloudy, however distant, however straight the path and demanding the climb, if you believe there is a right answer, I think you're a romantic too. And that's okay. I don't want to go on too long. I do want to say again that I am not here giving Elijah his full due, because you should just go listen to his episode. It is a very good episode. It'll be the first thing linked to in the show notes here. And I think he is, as always, much better read and much smarter than I. But I think he wants something different from literature. Again, I think this is an honest-to-God, clear-eyed disagreement that he is, has a perfectly... We got fusses going outside. I'm going to have to go in a second. But he has a very clear I think he knows what I think about this, and vice versa. And it came up briefly in the reading. Again, do go. I think it is sort of worth a look or a listen. The recording of the reading / conversation / shouting match in Cleveland that is up on YouTube. It's in 2 parts. One's longer, and the second one's much shorter. But I rewatched some parts of it, and it's like the audio is surprisingly good for being a fucking iPhone. But yeah, there's some interesting disagreement that comes up, and it's something along these lines is part of that disagreement. I wanted to read a whole passage from Darwin. Maybe I'll briefly read like a short thing from Darwin, because it seemed to me. Elijah also and I think I was very, very grateful for this, and this was actually kind of what got me. I paused the audio and I talked to my daughters for a little bit about Prometheus, because as Elijah points out, he focuses really on a slightly different angle, but the Prometheus story is sort of an interesting contrast to the Eden story, right? Eden combines 2 Greek myths, but I think in doing so, it is and I'm not suggesting historically, causally. I think they probably developed separately, or I don't know what caused what. But the Greeks have 2 stories to tell what the Hebrews have one. So Hebrews and Christians have one story for, right? In the Hebrew version, the Christian version, Adam and Eve are created by God. A serpent, who's often identified with the adversary of man, Satan, which is what Satan means, adversary. A serpent, not explicitly identified as Satan in Genesis, but a serpent tempts them to eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There are 2 forbidden trees: the tree of life, which would have given them eternal life, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And when they eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they attain knowledge of good and evil. And God's response when he learns of this is, now they will become like us. Because, of course, 2 of the qualities God has that Adam and Eve don't have, and that he does not want them to have, are knowledge of good and evil and eternal life. They got one of the 2, and thus we get one of the 2. Now, the serpent is an adversary, but is also subject to God's wrath just as much as Adam and Eve are. So they are all punished. They are all cast out of Eden. They are all wrong. They are, as Elijah points out, like when you were reading a story from a Christian or even, Jewish worldview, there is actually an objective right and wrong. And Adam and Eve are wrong. The serpent is wrong. God is right. And they are cast out of Eden. They attain self-knowledge. They attain, clarity. Sometimes this is used as a marker for sentience, as we sort of discussed in that other pseudo Adam and Eve story in The Last Messiah, the Zapfa essay. But the Greeks have 2 different stories that do this work, and I think it's actually more interesting by being 2 different stories. The simpler story is the story of Pandora, which is the god Zeus, who is right by virtue of might. He is more powerful than all the other gods combined. Zeus he creates a woman, Pandora, and he creates her to be gullible and over curious. And then he sends her to Earth, and he gives her a box or a jar, I think in the original. And the instructions are not to open the jar, but of course she does open it, and all of the evils of mortal life escape. And so in that story, there is a little bit of a version of Adam's curse is to sweat for his bread, and Eve's curse is to suffer in childbirth, and the serpent's curse is to crawl in his belly in the dust, and man will strike at his head, and he will strike at man's heel, and so on. That is a little bit what we get when Pandora opens her box. We get envy and gossip and illness and all of the miseries of mortal life on Earth. And the funny twist, I mentioned this before, that it was only in, I think it's Bernard Evsland's little version of the Greek myth, that the hope, the button on this story is that there was one thing left in the jar that the gods put in that was nice, a good thing, a good gift. And Pandora clapped the jar shut before this last thing could get out, and it was hope. And so we have all these bad things, but we still have hope. And as I mentioned before, I think a million episodes ago, that never made sense to me. Talking to Josie today, it didn't make sense to her either. Because well, wait a minute, when the bad things got out of the jar, then they were in our lives. But when hope stays in the jar, then we have hope? Why does that work? Also, why did they put a nice thing in the jar? And of course, the version that is 1,000 times clearer and bleaker, as translated in the Bernard Evslin anthology, is that the last curse in the jar was a curse. It was foreknowledge. It was an understanding of what would happen to you in the future. And if you have foreknowledge, then you have no hope. Now, the hope that you have when you don't have foreknowledge is false. You do not have hope because things could turn out well. You have hope because you think they could turn out well. And that was the final curse spared us when Pandora clapped the jar shut. The other half of the story, or the other story that is, I think, combined and simplified by the Eden story, is, of course, the story of Prometheus. And this is the story that precedes the Pandora story. Prometheus, who, along with his brother Epimetheus, Prometheus means forethought and Epimetheus means afterthought, they made mankind. They made all of the animals, and then they made mankind, and Epimetheus, being afterthought, forgot to save any good stuff for mankind. So we were just these naked, upright apes with no good claws and no good teeth and no good speed and no good wings or spikes or anything like that, and kind of shitty eyes that couldn't even see in the dark. And so, actually, we have excellent eyes, but we can't see in the dark, and little weak wobbly babies and all this stuff. And so Prometheus, of course, steals fire from the gods and gives it to mankind. And fight, like the reliable control of fire is truly like one of the most important moments in human existence. Like, it's not historical because it's prehistorical, but like truly one of the most important turns in human development was the ability to control and somewhat reliably control fire. I mean, probably like the biggest development was then the ability to protect fire from being extinguished, but also to create it, to spark it. That's the real game changer, because it allows you to do several things. It allows you to cook meat, which then gives us a better source of nutrients. It allows us to create a hearth with warmth and a center. It allows us light at nighttime. And light in the dark is huge. It's also a very nice symbol, of course. Prometheus did this for us because he and his brother made us, and he wanted to help us. That is, Prometheus is the god, and arguably, and this is something Elijah does, I think, point out quite nicely, arguably the only god who loves us, and who loves us in a non-passive-aggressive, bipolar, abusive husband way. Like, I have to say, sometimes the Hebrew and Christian gods seem to love us. They love us a little bit like he hit me and it felt like a kiss. But Prometheus just loves us. And his reward for doing this is that he is chained to a rock for eternity, and he has his liver ripped out by an eagle every day. And that's it. I think eventually Heracles saves him, but what's wonderful about the Prometheus story is that there's no right and wrong to this. There's just Prometheus's love, and if his love for us is wrong, if his excess, if his sin, his theft is wrong, it's wrong only because Zeus is more powerful than he is. And we attain knowledge, but not because we did something good or bad, just because a god loved us and then suffered as a result, and we moved on. I think there's something slightly more sour about the Pandora story, and even though the Evslin version with foreknowledge rather than hope being trapped in the jar makes much more sense, is much more coherent, there is also something rather puny about it, because we might wish and try and struggle and think, but ultimately there isn't a greater perspective than ours. There's a perspective outside of ours from which the answer is already decided, right? And if that, like, as in the kind of book I think most people seem to think Madame Bovary is. Like, there is a right answer ultimately outside of the book. And Emma is struggling, and Emma struggles and suffers and errs and is ultimately punished for her error. But outside the book, however difficult, however complex, there is finally some clarity, some true answer. And I think like the real difference between the Greek vision of the world, in which there is the Pandoran, or I guess I can call it the Pandoran vision of the world, where there is a final answer, there is a final truth, and we labor in darkness without understanding it. I mean, pun intended or not, metaphor mixed or not. The real difference between that view and my view, which is similarly fatalistic, right? I similarly don't think we really have that much choice or that much ability to impact our fates. Ultimately, I do. We've discussed. I'm not a big believer in free will, though I think there is something. It is meaningful for us to discuss our choices and their causes and their consequences in our lives from our perspective, because that's our experience of the world. But the biggest difference is that for the Greeks, there was finally a person who could see the bigger picture. Unlike us, there was an author of the book who could see all of it, and who could know. There was the blind men who were groping at the elephant and thinking it was a column or a rope. But then there were the people with sight. There were the other people. There was the author of the book. There was the laughing audience. There was the sighted people. There were the gods, and they knew the real right story. And I think in my vision of the world, yes, we are trapped, and yes, things are limited, and yes, we have very little, if anything, in the way of free will. But there is no greater, wiser perspective. There is no person who knows the right answers. And the books I love best are those in which the authors seem to know that they know that they are also blind men groping at the elephant. They know that even if they are writing the play, they are also in the play. That when they say, Madame Bovary, c'est moi, they're not saying Madame Bovary was me or could have been me. They're saying she is me. Because when I read the book, that's what I think. I think she is me. So I did want to read this little passage from Darwin. He says, "Nothing is easier than to admit in words the truth of the universal struggle for life, or more difficult. At least I have found it so." I love that. At least I have found it so. I have found it difficult. Have found, not did find, have found. Continue to find it difficult. Then constantly to bear this conclusion in mind. Nothing is easier to admit in words the truth of the universal struggle for life, or more difficult, at least I have found it so, than constantly to bear this conclusion in mind. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. We behold the face of nature bright with gladness. We often see superabundance of food. We do not see, or we forget, that the birds which are idly singing round us mostly live on insects or seeds, and are thus constantly destroying life. Or we forget how largely these songsters or their eggs or their nestlings are destroyed by birds and beasts of prey. We do not always bear in mind that though food may now be superabundant, it is not so at all seasons of each recurring year. And then he ends that chapter with this just crushing passage, just like justly celebrated passage. Oh, actually, no, sorry. I'm going to skip ahead to a slightly different passage. Much later chapter. I was thinking of that. The end of that chapter is famous, but it's the different one that I want to read. Much later. He says, Finally, it may not be a logical deduction, but to my imagination, this is present tense for Darwin, to my imagination, it is far more satisfactory to look at such instincts. He's about to list some natural instincts. It is far more satisfactory to look at such instincts as the young cuckoo ejecting its foster brothers, ants making slaves, the larvae of Ichneumonidae feeding within the live bodies of caterpillars. It's far more satisfactory to look at these instincts not as specially endowed or created instincts, but as small consequences of one general law, leading to the advancement of all organic beings, namely, multiply, vary, let the strongest live, and the weakest die. There's no conclusion. There's no moral. And again, I can't say enough that Elijah never endorses simplistic morals or Aesop's fables sort of stories. But the Aesop's fables are pretty fucking fantastic. But again, do go listen to his episode. That's where, take his opinion not from me, but from him. But yeah, I think, is Emma Bovary a fool? Absolutely. I think she's like one of those caterpillars getting eaten alive by a wasp. Or maybe she's like one of the wasp larvae eating a caterpillar alive. She's foolish and she's limited, and she's bumbling along, swatting at, the various evils that emerged from Pandora's jar. But there's not an audience watching who's all right, who's all in the right. And you know what? If readers do read Madame Bovary and think they're in the right and Emma Bovary's in the wrong, they're wrong too. But the good news is there's not an audience watching them. We're just all on stage together. All right, I want to end with a poem that flies in the face of everything I've said today, because it's just a poem I like, and it's a poem at the AMA, which I reposted on the main feed recently. A listener asked, what was a poem? I think it was Coleman. What was a poem we were embarrassed to love? And I mentioned Kipling's If. But here's another poem that I find myself kind of embarrassed to love, because it is philosophically, it is it's like a bad combination of like an ultimately moral vision of the universe, along with like an Arthur C. Brooks self-helpy, like, hey, don't be like Emma Bovary. Decide that it's okay for you to be an inconsequential rube living in the provinces. Don't reach for something higher than your station. Just accept that you're not one of the main characters of life. And all those people living in Paris or New York or Cincinnati, or not Cincinnati. Sorry, Cincinnati. That's what a bizarre Freudian slip. My sister lives in Cincinnati, and she is actually a very successful businesswoman. So maybe that's what I was thinking of. Or Moscow. Right, Paris or Moscow or New York. Those people are maybe those are the real maybe the main characters. Maybe I, Arthur C. Brooks, am the main character. But you should be satisfied with living in the provinces and not make yourself miserable by being like Emma Bovary. This poem has a lot of that feel to it, and yet I love it anyway. I just do. Is it corny? Yes. Is it moralizing? Yes. Is it, I think, philosophically deeply mistaken? Yes. I still love it. And it still makes me like teary-eyed when I read it. So what are you going to do? Happy birthday to me. This is The God Who Loves You by Carl Dennis. It must be troubling for the God who loves you to ponder how much happier you'd be today had you been able to glimpse your many futures. It must be painful for him to watch you on Friday evenings, driving home from the office, content with your week, 3 fine houses sold to deserving families, knowing, as he does, exactly what would have happened had you gone to your second choice for college, knowing the roommate you'd have been allotted, whose ardent opinions on painting and music would have kindled in you a lifelong passion. A life 30 points above the life you're living on any scale of satisfaction. And every point a thorn in the side of the God who loves you. You don't want that. A large-souled man like you, who tries to withhold from your wife the day's disappointments so she can save her empathy for the children? And would you want this God to compare your wife with the woman you were destined to meet on the other campus? It hurts you to think of him ranking the conversation you'd have enjoyed over there higher in insight than the conversation you're used to. And think how this loving God would feel knowing that the man next in line for your wife would have pleased her more than you ever will, even on your best days, when you really try. Can you sleep at night believing a God like that is pacing his cloudy bedroom, harassed by alternatives you're spared by ignorance? The difference between what is and what could have been will remain alive for him even after you cease existing. After you catch a chill running out in the snow for the morning paper, losing 11 years that the God who loves you will feel compelled to imagine scene by scene unless you come to the rescue by imagining him no wiser than you are. No God at all. Only a friend no closer than the actual friend you made at college. The one you haven't written in months. Sit down tonight and write him about the life you can talk about with a claim to authority. The life you've witnessed, which for all you know is the life you've chosen. It gets me. It fucking gets me every time. And I know it shouldn't, but it does. So maybe Elijah's right after all. What do I know? That's The God Who Loves You by Carl Dennis. The only other thought that comes to mind is that my stepmother, the real estate agent, probably thinks that selling 3 houses in 1 week is a pretty fucking good week. That's what, like 150 houses a year? Like that's, yeah. This is no second best life this guy's living. All right, that's enough. Enough for now. It's my birthday. I gotta go see what my girls are fighting about. I'm no God, but I love you all. Thanks for listening. See you soon.